Buenas tardes con todas y todos. Es un gran honor para mí presentar a Bernard Stiegler, uno de los filósofos más destacados en el mundo, uno de los intérpretes de nuestro presente más interesantes, y es un gran placer tenerlo aquí con nosotros. Muchos estudiantes ya conocen algunos conceptos de Stiegler, son conceptos verdaderamente revolucionarios que supieron transformar la manera de hacer filosofía en la contemporaneidad. Stiegler ha sido profesor de varias universidades, recién se jubiló de una universidad de París, pero sigue dando clases como profesor invitado en China, y es presidente del Instituto de Investigación e Innovación de París, l'IRI, Instituto de Recherche e Innovación. Y entre los varios proyectos que está llevando a cabo y que está dirigiendo, es también el director de un proyecto internacional que está, digamos, ligado a las Naciones Unidas y que tiene el nombre, digamos, de internación, que es un concepto que viene de Marcel Mauss, el antropólogo, y que Stiegler retoma en esta época, que es una época, como sabemos, de grandes crisis, como por ejemplo la crisis del cambio climático y de lo que se suele llamar el antropoceno. Y este proyecto es un proyecto que en enero de 2020, digamos, tendrá como un gran evento en Ginebra, en Suiza, y de hecho se llama justamente Genève 2020. Es un proyecto que abarca varias universidades, varios actores, no solamente académicos, sino del mundo industrial, del mundo de las luchas, digamos, de la internacionalización, de la investigación y del saber. Es un proyecto a la vez, digamos, de análisis crítico de la contemporaneidad y, digamos, quiere desarrollar una propuesta concreta para enfrentar, digamos, los temas más calientes de este siglo, ¿no? Entonces, no solamente el cambio climático, sino, como sabemos, el tema ligado a las fronteras, a las migraciones, el tema de las tecnologías, el tema de la proletarización, es decir, de la pérdida de conocimiento, que es una experiencia que nosotros hacemos diariamente, ¿no? Cuando nos conectamos en Internet, cuando utilizamos los dispositivos tecnológicos. Bueno, Stiegler está liderando este proyecto y sabemos que hay un interés por parte de Huartes en, digamos, involucrarse y colaborar con todo el grupo y todo el movimiento que va desarrollándose. Y entonces esta, digamos, lo podemos pensar también como esta charla como un momento, ¿no? Digamos, para compartir conocimientos y perspectivas críticas alrededor de un tema que es un tema no solamente tecnológico, no solamente urbano, sino precisamente político, ¿no? Y bueno, dejo la palabra a Bernard y buena escucha.
Thank you very much, Paolo. It's really a great pleasure to be there for me today in Guayaquil. It's a result of a discussion we started with Ramiro Noriega 7 years ago. And in a project we had at this time to cooperate about the notion of contribution, also with Pablo Cardoso, who is there, and many other people, many other friends who are there. And it's really a great satisfaction for me to be able to participate to this very interesting meeting that I find extremely fruitful, and I was really impressed in the morning by the topics, also the one by Sarah. And so for me it's giving hope for the future to be there. So thank you very much to everybody. I will control my images on my screen here, and Paolo will control in the regie upstairs, but I need to see my images. If I don't see the images, I cannot talk. So This is the reason for which I open my files here. And maybe you can see a quotation of Paul Valéry here, who says, the best way in order to realize your dreams is to wake up. So let's wake up. This is the starting point of my topic today. What will the 21st century have been at the beginning of the 22nd century for those who will still be living in the biosphere in 1 century? Which itself, the biosphere became a technosphere during the 19th and the 20th centuries, also known today as the Anthropocene era. Such is the question raised by the most recent IPCC reports, as well as by the Antonio Guterres comments on the 24th January 2019 at the World Economic Forum in Davos. For the moment, we already know. What we already know is that the 21st century is, first, the century of the possible definitive closure of the neganthropic difference of entropy, difference with the A in the sense of Jacques Derrida, that we call life. And consequently, second, the century of our responsibility to protect life in all its forms. Appearing on Earth more than 3 billion years ago, life became more complex in becoming cellular, then multicellular, thereby constituting living bodies, plants and animals, composed of internal organs, themselves multicellular, to which Jean-Baptiste Lamarck gave the name organisms. And then I see that it lacks, yes, it's not a good picture, I'm sorry, it's the same on my computer. I wanted to show you a bean. That is the following one, Paolo, this one. Yes, this is a multicellular plant organism. Those are composed of internal organs, themselves multicellular, to which Jean-Baptiste Lamarck gave the name organisms in the 18th century, and at the end of the 18th century. And then, 3 million years ago, what I call exorganisms appeared, that is, organisms capable of forming with their endosomatic organs, and in particular with their hands in the previous, the previous one, sorry, Paolo. Yes, thank you. Forming with their endosomatic organs, and in particular with their hands, but also their brain, exosomatic organs that are those organs. Oh, sorry, I have a problem with my own computer, sorry. What I call exorganisms are what are more commonly called human beings, like you and me. Because for them, exosomatic organs are more important than endosomatic organs. For example, in the way that Stephen Hawking was someone who turned his disabled and incapacitated condition into a thought of physics and thus of movement. Or that Homer was, je ne sais pas ce qui m'arrive avec ça. Homer was a blind man who allowed us to see, or Stevie Wonder, or Ray Charles, and here we should refer to also Charlie Parker and John Coltrane, and to their relationship to heroin, because they were addicted, junkies, as we say. But I won't do that now. While Django Reinhardt with his paralyzed fingers, reinvented how to play the guitar, but also Robert Wyatt wrote and played rock bottom in his wheelchair, and also the poet, the French poet Joe Bousquet, poetized by becoming the quasi-cause of his own wound, as he said, as we learn from Gilles Deleuze. These singularities are ways of giving form to exosomatization, as modeling and shaping that is scholarly, noetic, artistic, exceptional and incomparable, incalculable and inexhaustible. That these ways are inexhaustible means that they nourish what I call the spiritual necromass, or the noetic humus, from forest spirits and the cult of the dead to databases via the Library of Alexandria. Once again, I have a problem with my laptop. Via the Library of Alexandria, today lost, and the royal libraries that were funded throughout Europe, and via the museums, first in Athens, becoming in the Republic of Letters, Cabinet de Curiosité, all this leading to Le Louvre as the national museum and to its emancipatory ideal as dreamed by Diderot, who wake up, and Louis-Sébastien Mercier in France during the French Revolution. Well, what is a work? Une œuvre, as we say in French. It is what opens up, ce qui ouvre, an exosomatization, which becomes the new law of evolution, exosomatization, as it is described by the American biologist Alfred Lotka, and remains there as a fundamental component of the spiritual necromass, come noetic humus, through the work of study as it is recommended here by the Japanese philosopher Fukuzawa. A path through which the entropic becoming, brought to light by thermodynamics, is reversed, or rather forms a loop. That is, a recursivity, itself inscribed in a complex tangle of loops. This entanglement of loops can temporarily form into what I call a negantropic locality, negantropic with an A and an H. This is what was already done, this reversal of the entropy by life, as it was described by Schrödinger in 1944. But in another mode than the exosomatic beings or exorganisms, life doing so precisely in the endosomatic mode, not exosomatic one. Whereas a negantropic locality is what diverts the arrow of time by deferring it and differentiating it, and at the same time pharmacologically accelerating it, at the risk in the Anthropocene of provoking an irreversible collapse. A work, inasmuch as it fundamentally and irreducibly stems from exosomatization, on the one hand makes it possible to defer and defer the onrush of the arrow of time towards entropy and entropy with A and H. On the other hand, also leads to its acceleration, but by a detour that, in so doing, conceals it. Hence, we need to take care of the works bequeathed to us in order to increase their difference with A through what Jacques Derrida called their dissemination, and so as to reduce their inevitable toxicity. Works, being essentially exosomatic, are in fact and essentially pharmaca, curative but also poisonous. Even an artwork can become, or a philosophical work can become poisonous with, for example, Nietzsche read by Hitler. Works can be artisanal objects, which begin to be fashioned 3 million years ago, works of art, which begin to be fashioned more than 30,000 years ago, written works, whether intellectual or juridical, of which the Hammurabi Code is one of the oldest cases, appearing 4,000 years ago. What is a work of art? It is what appears around 30,000 years ago, of which Lascaux is a more recent instance dating from 17,000 years ago, hence more than 10,000 years ago after the first known works of art, and which Lascaux in Georges Bataille finds the spectator who will write Lascaux or the birth of art. Starting from this shock, I quote him, he says, "At one point, night gave birth to day, and the daylight we find at Lascaux illumines the morning of our immediate species. It is a man who dwelt in this cave of whom, for the first time and with certainty, we may finally say, he produced works of art. He is of our sort," unquote. No doubt, one could object that today we should go back to Chauvet, the cave of Chauvet in France, where there are works painted 35,000 years ago, in order to find this dawn born from night. But this is of little importance. If it is true that the one whom Bataille called Homo ludens makes exosomatization into art, and the question this raises is of knowing if what Donald Winnicott described as the transitional space between mother and child also appears at this stage of exosomatization. This nascent art, by this making, marks the emergence of those who, having made possible the experience of a clear evidence of art, we can call us, we can say, we who begin there, exorganisms belonging to the human race because they recognize themselves in it. If, therefore, this premise is true, then we must conclude that art has a very specific responsibility in the face of the transhumanist fable of what has come to be known as the singularity. The work of art opens the era of what, after Aristotle, we should call the noetic soul, even if we can thus no longer conceive noeticity quite like Aristotle, since in the way we are conceiving the work of art, it belongs to the pursuit of exosomatization that began 3 million years earlier, an age that, in this way, would still have been pre-noetic. Whether pre-noetic or noetic, like Homo ludens in Bataille's sense, the work is a technical exteriorization, and it arises from this primordial technicity. It opens only at this price. It is not only the work of art that is technical. Noesis in general, noesis meaning in Greek thinking, noesis in general is equally so, technical, and in totality. But this is what, with Plato, nascent philosophy rejects. And this rejection, which is its very foundation of philosophy, will last all the way to Marx, who himself swings between two positions, according to this problem. To achieve what Nietzsche will call the transvaluation of all values is to overcome this rejection by performatively taking with Nietzsche, who entrusts this task to philosophical art and to artistic philosophy, a step beyond Nietzsche, a step that would be a dance step, but one that risks being a dance macabre. This risk is the yardstick of what is entailed by the work of art in the 21st century. In what follows, and in passing through Joseph Beuys, I will try to show that the philosopher and the artist today have the responsibility and the task of, together, also with scientists, engineers, etc., becoming the gardeners of the biospheric locality, because locality is first of all the biosphere, which they must, the philosopher and the artist, think and care about. In French, I say that penser with an A. That means taking care. At all scales of locality, such that they hybridize and creolize it, according to the analysis of Edouard Glissant, where this implies a task of political economy of a completely new kind, which is also a poetic economy, and where the challenge of art is no more and no less than to reinvent work, which in turn implies the need to reinvent money, and this is what Beuys teaches here in this book. And I will go back to this question later. Conceived as such a care, un soin in French, in biospheric locality, concatenated at various creolized scales, and in the test and ordeal of what Achille Mbembe calls the becoming black. In French, it is devenir nègre. It's not black, it's nigger. Of what from the biosphere has become a technosphere, conceived in such a way, then, as a care of this kind, every work is always, and in the 21st century more than ever, a bandage or a dressing, we say in French, un pansement, from the verb penser with an A. That is for me the first meaning of thinking, penser with an E, that can always become infected. It must regularly be changed, the pansement, the bandage, the dressing, which in a trivial sense means that it is not possible in the 15th century to produce work like that in the Chauvet cave, for example, nor in the 19th century it is possible, it's not possible to do so like Leonardo da Vinci, nor in the 20th century it is possible to think like Karl Marx, nor in the 21st century to repeat Marcel Duchamp or Joseph Beuys, even though it is necessary to produce with them insofar as they are dead and preserved in their works, which thus constitute what I call tertiary retentions, and even though, as Glissant says, everything begins with repetition, and for this it is necessary to conserve the dressing, le pansement, that has been changed by metabolizing it, and through what I will describe a noetic humus, a noetic necromass. Maybe you know that humus is produced by the leaves of trees. It is dead vegetation, and this is a condition of life. So it's impossible to oppose life and death. It is necessary to articulate them. And with endosomatic form of life, it is what we know as a humus, but in exosomatic form of life, it is for example, the University of Las Artes in Guayaquil, that is producing such a transformation of the death into life. Every work is technical, I said, but it is less than it is less than 3 centuries since the emergence of technology, in the sense referred to by Heidegger as modern technology, and from which arose what he called also Gestalt, that is the cybernetic and atomic age of technology. We ourselves now refer to the age of modern technology as the Anthropocene era. And we ask ourselves, along with the IPCC and numerous other key observers and actors of the Anthropocene era, including the Secretary General of the United Nations, and we do so after Gunther Anders, but also after Vladimir Vernadsky, Alfred Lotka, and Arnold Toynbee, we ask then, is the Anthropocene era the end age, the apocalypse? The end is what always presents itself like Janus, both as the termination of what seemed interminable, for example, as the heat death of the universe or as the death of the sun, and as a goal, a finality, in finalité, we say in French, characteristic of life insofar as it amounts to an unfinished crystallization, according to Gilbert Simondon, but such that 3 million years ago, according to André Leroy-Gourand, and then to Alfred Lotka in this paper, a new form emerges so that the unfinished manifests itself through the accumulation of works of all kinds, whether literary, like in this one, or artistic, or architectural and urban. Becoming urban, that is a pharmacological becoming. And this is a very beautiful city, that is Tirana in, comment ça s'appelle? Oh, sorry. Yes, excuse me, Paolo, because I forgot to, yes, thank you, it's perfect. This place is Tirana, where the mayor, the burgmaster, decided to transform the city with the inhabitants and said to them, you are artists, you can change the city. I give you colors and you will modify the place, your public place. And this is, for me, what is art, really. Now, we are entering into the age of smart cities. Urban spaces are becoming smart spaces. But there are all kinds of noetic localities and on all kinds of scales, including, as I have already mentioned, the scale of the biosphere itself. In pre-noesis, as in noesis, the unfinished character of life is no longer manifested simply or fundamentally through the specific and evolutionary reproduction of the organs characteristic of what we call a species, but through the different with an A in the sense of Derrida, reproduction of works, even mechanical, as Walter Benjamin said, in the sense that Heidegger gives to this word work by looking at this work, then by reading Rainer Maria Rilke's sonnet to Orpheus, but also in the sense that Ignaz Meyerson, in this book, I recommend you to read, it's a very important book, gives to this word in this major work. What happens when today's most powerful designers, producers, and operators around the technosphere, the GAFAM, Google, Amazon, Facebook, Apple, and Microsoft, or a large majority of them, claim that contemporary exosomatic organogenesis will soon be reaching perfection, and thus the so-called singularity. Confiscating, spoiling, and obliterating in advance as if to leave it inaudible, invisible, and insensible, the essential question of singularity with which Gilles Deleuze objected to the thought systems of the universal, and which Heidegger tried to find in Dasein, leading him to later posit that in the era of Gestalt, this Dasein is no longer the first question. What has happened is that exosomatization has reached an eschatological limit, which leads to the claim that the process of exosomatization is finished and no longer needs what was called man, which I prefer to call myself after Socrates, dialogical noises, which is also to say dianoetic noises, dianoetic noises, that is always already divided and thus unfinished. And after Aristotle, the noetic soul, I call it the noetic soul, as a type of mobility, says Aristotle, vegetative and sensitive souls designating other types of mobility, mobility in general being in his ontology the desire of the first immobile mover. When Masaki Fujita, a Japanese artist, presents his conquest of imperfection, he attests that what is at stake here is a quasi-causal necessity of exosomatic contingency, unthought and untreated by philosophy. And this is why we should look at the works of Fujita. These works should be understood together with Gilles Deleuze's consideration of Joe Bousquet, Scott Fitzgerald, Malcolm Lowry, and Alice in Wonderland, on the basis of the noetic humus of the Stoics, whom it is a question of reading for ourselves, that is, of humidifying for ourselves. I says humidifying because the name of humus means humidified. Humidifying for ourselves means by treating and taking for oneself, that I say in French, penser par soi-même, taking care by yourself, by oneself, with one's tears, saliva, one's psychosomatic moods, humeur in French, humus, humid, humeur, it's the same word, that are always ready to become infected. The Stoics being themselves the first thinkers and treaters of such dressings and treatments that are pansement. A pansement that is also the stake of this piano for Joseph Beuys. That's interesting. Can we read Joseph Beuys' open letter, for example, by presenting this, I no longer belong to art, with this an artist who was Marcel Duchamp, and vice versa? If yes, why and how? If no, why not? And what to do now, then, and through this communication that I try to give to you now? What to do with what Fujita tells us about imperfection as conquest? To read Marcel Duchamp with Joseph Beuys and vice versa would be to begin by remembering that when Duchamp stops paintings, he reflects on the proletarianization of production in all its forms. That is, a proletarianization of production as exosomatization in all its forms, whereas it is by thinking and treating or taking care of art starting from a reconsideration of work that Beuys opens the question of social sculpture, and does so by way of Epimetheus, the god, who is the brother of Prometheus. As for what happens to these questions in the 21st century, I maintain, together with a group whose aim is to form a noetic internation, you will find explanation on this side, that we must completely rethink global economy as a struggle against entropy in the Anthropocene, and consequently as a reconstruction of localities, because to struggle against entropy is to produce negentropy, and negentropy is possible only as locality. We must do so in order to enter into what I call the Neganthropocene era, where the Anthropocene era seems to have led to the exospheric and exorbitant age of exosomatic evolution, which seems, for this reason, does indeed seem to constitute a terminal stage, including in the sense of the IPCC in this report, for example, but which is also a kind of endosomatization of the exosomatization by, for example, introducing into the brain artificial chips, etc., etc. This is the stake of what is called now neurotechnology, and this is the future. I maintain this with this group that is called International Group or Geneva 2020, that in the Anthropocene era, in order to live it, art and philosophy must reconsider from the exosomatic standpoint the questions first of culture as social culture, of which exosomatization is both cause and consequence, and second, of gardening, which at a deeper level this culture must be, given that with respect to this social and its taking form, this firstly involves an experience of the world, and in this sense an education, as Noel says, which is characterized by undergoing a process of pruning, to which the synaptogenesis of the brain amounts, since, I quote here Jean-Pierre Changeux, to learn is to eliminate, he says that in this book, the neural man. Life in general is the sculpture of the living, but also of the dead, and as a necromass, Vernadsky shows that the biomass feeds on the necromass with the help of the sun, as well as cellular death, for example, as it is shown by Jean-Claude Amezen in this book, but also by Derrida in this one, La Vie, la Mort, that was just published last year in Paris. But also in this book by Francesco Vitale, Biodeconstruction. But here we must open the question of gene therapies and restriction enzymes, inasmuch as they indeed enable sculpting rather than gardening. And this is, of course, what you know as what is called now genetic medicine or genic medicine. With all this, and with the artist of artificial life who is Stellark, but also with Eduardo Kac, for example, and his bio-art, about which we can wonder, however, what it's playing at. I have doubts about this work. Or with Orlan, the French artist, and with many others, questions are raised ahead of the curve on the state of scientific art, and this requires a much deeper investigation of the question of the relationship between art, science, technology, and economics, and their co-responsibilities. For this, we should reread Joseph Beuys, which in no way means to parrot him, that is, to repeat him in a sterile and stereotypical fashion, to take up a Beuysian posture as a Beuysian artist, which could only be ridiculous, but to critique him in the Kantian sense as well as in the Goethean sense, because critique for Goethe was the most important question for the poets. With Harlan, who published Joseph Beuys, what Harlan says here in this text is important. The question that Beuys raises is firstly that of exercise, which must ultimately lead to social sculpture. What Beuys claims above all is that noesis is artistic, and that all noetic exorganisms, together constituting what he calls the social organism, what I call myself the complex exorganisms, are artists in potential. All of them, which is equally to say philosophers in potential. All are sculptors and gardeners, which is true in the sense that the gardener sculpts the living by pruning what they have planted in a soil that is plasticized, loosened, enriched as humus that must be metabolized in multiple ways, from the best to the worst, and in the sense that education, as conceived by Noel, but also Glenn Ram, takes care of and treats noetic life insofar as it is pharmacological, always curative and poisonous. Even mathematics, for example. Applied mathematics today can become with these stupid guys who his name, what is his name? The founder of Facebook. Zuckerberg, this stupid guy who is Zuckerberg, is applying mathematics. You know. I would now like to return to the conquest of imperfection, which announces a task, an injunction or commitment that also seems to present itself as a retrospective gaze projecting a future remaining yet to come, and does so by inscribing it into ineluctably entropic becoming, but as a bifurcation that we must, after Bailly, Longo, and Monteville, consider as anti-entropic. Bifurcation being also a concept of Whitehead. I would like to return to Fujiyata's question, but by now quickly reading in a very introductory way, Introduction à la politique du divers by Edouard Glissant and Introduction à la politique de la relation, on the basis of which I will open up some consideration after and with Achille Mbembe's Critique de la raison nègre. Why invoke these works in order to take a step beyond Boyce's social sculpture and gardening for which it calls? First of all, to draw attention to two questions that I and the Geneva 2020 group believe to be highly aporetic and characteristic of the real and fundamental challenges of the Anthropocene era and of the effective possibilities, albeit very improbable, incalculable, and stemming from a will of leaving the Anthropocene along a path leading towards what I call the Neg-Anthropocene era. These two challenges are first, that there is no social sculpture nor any vegetable or noetic gardening without tools and instruments. That is, without this being inscribed into a stage of exosomatic evolution. And second, that the performative acts of sculpture and gardening made possible by the practice of these instruments always produce a locality while coming from another locality, which leads to what Glissant calls creolization. It is a question, however, of knowing if this creolization remains in effect today, and if it is still possible when the technologies of the data economy generate the becoming black or devenir nègre that Mbembe tries to think and treat, and that Yves Citon also investigates with Fred Morton and his thought of the undercommons. I'm sorry, it is the following one, please, Paolo. Thank you. Before turning to all too brief reading, before turning to this all too brief reading, let's recap what was said. Art is what affirms the end of the world in exosomatization. This end having two phases. Exosomatization is the conquest of imperfection such that always the exosomatic organs that are works and that arise from noetic dreams in the sense made thinkable or careable, pensable with an A by Paul Valéry, but also by how Miyazaki end up revealing their irreducible nightmarish potentialities. It is in Le Vent se lève, I don't remember the name in English. The worst is the perfection promised by the new slave traders that are the GAFAM. The best is what provides the opportunity for sculpting and gardening exercises through which it is possible to develop contributory economy that struggles against entropy in its 3 dimensions: thermodynamic, biology, and information, and therefore against entropy with an A and an H, which is the program of the contributory learning territory. You can find explanations on this website. This is a project we are leading in the in the suburbs of Paris for 10 years. Such a struggle necessarily involves a re-evaluation of locality and of its relation with instruments, which by opening it and deterritorializing it can both creolize it and to hybridize it, to cross it, le métisser, as it is said by Édouard Glissant, in the strict sense of Glissant, by imposing on it from outside a logic that empties it of meaning, or that, on the contrary, gives rise to new effective singularities. For example, this one. The name is Charlie Parker. These are the stakes of Glissant's Poétique du divers, but I don't think that it brings them to the level that I would now like to introduce in order to read it with Membe and vice versa. To read Membe with Glissant, and all this with Boyce and against Boyce, right up against Boyce, whose understanding of Epimetheus remains, from my point of view, too superficial, but very interesting nevertheless. Glissant speaks of the Caribbean Sea, which he distinguishes from the Mediterranean by positing that the latter in relation to the Caribbean is concentrated, he says. By contrast, the Caribbean is an open sea. I quote, a sea that diffracts and that carries the excited commotion of diversity, unquote. Diversity. This is a key word, opposed here to the Mediterranean, which inclines towards a thought of the one and of unity, he says, unquote. Is it enough, however, to give such weight to geographical location? Isn't it too deterministic? Of course not. Just as without certain types of boats, maps, compasses, and many other things, the Caribbean would not have been opened by diffraction. Likewise, without its own boats, there were not yet any compasses. Without its maps, more rudimentary than those of 1492, and especially without the alphabetic reticulation on the basis of which the Greek colonies would be settled by, while in Judea the society of the one book would be formed along with the considerable and utterly transformational power of grammatization. On this question, you can read Jean-Pierre Vernant and Sylvain Auroux. Without all of that, the Mediterranean would never have inclined towards a thought of the one and of unity. So it's not only a question of geography or of locality, it's a question of technology, of course. We should not, in passing that distraction, is the metaphor that André Leroy uses to describe how what he calls technical tendencies are realized by projecting themselves through the interior milieus of what he calls ethnic cells, which diffracts them into a vast diversity of technical facts constituting a technical milieu. I will not develop that, but it's extremely important for understanding why locality is not localism in the sense of Salvini or Marine Le Pen in France, or also nationalism of Hitler, for example. Creolization occurs in the Caribbean as a real intertwining, and fusing of cultural, I quote, cultural elements from absolutely diverse backgrounds, unquote, in such a way that it engenders, I quote, something absolutely unpredictable, that is, incalculable, improbable. This creolization occurs in Neo-America in such a way that, I quote again, slavery, oppression, and dispossession, all these crimes brings to reality a genuine conversion of being. Conversion of being. Such an expression, you can find it in Zeit und Sein of Heidegger, addressing the question of the Gestalt transformed into Ereignis. And I know that Glissant read this text because I met him 5 years ago. This conversion, however, is not limited to Caribbean and no Neo-America. It, as he says, operates throughout the whole world. This is so because the culture of the world are brought into contact in an absolutely devastating way. It was a quotation. It should be noted first that at that time, that is in 1996, Edouard Glissant could have known nothing of social networks and very little about digital networks. It was just 3 years after the beginning of the World Wide Web. And second, that he does not discuss the effects of the culture industries, effects that were to a large extent anticipated by Adorno and Horkheimer in 1944, along with Gunther Anders, and to a certain extent Hannah Arendt, but also, of course, Heidegger, and finally Marcuse, Debord, Henri Lefebvre, and others. And this is why, when on page 24 of this book, Poétique de la Diversité, he notes that the planetary flows that affect Martinique can also be alienating. This analysis seems to me to be quite deficient. It's not sufficient to say that. It needs a pharmacology of creolization. These are the pharmacological technologies typical of a certain age of exosomatization, and they constitute the context of creolization described here as a global process. While the pharmacological technology that characterized the becoming one of the Mediterranean under the influence of of the sophists, and in Judea of the scribes, became the issue at stake in Plato's academy, in Aristotle's Lyceum and Museum, in the synagogue as a place in Jerusalem for forming and training a hermeneutic community. Then, a little later, at the library that Alexander, Aristotle's pupil, made possible with Ptolemies in the city that would bear his name, Alexandria. Glissant emphasizes the mediatic fusion, or more broadly, medial fusion, if we take up Augustin Berg's term, the geographer, is the bearer of conflicts and clashes, but also brings with it advances, I quote, in consciousness and hope, unquote. I would therefore say that it is pharmacological. But despite this, Glissant does not thematize this double dimension, which I consider essential and primordial. On the basis of these reflections on the roots of creolization, he distinguishes 3 kinds of peoples of Neo-America. People such as, after the indigenes, the Amerindians, people such as I quote, the migrant peoples of Europe arriving with their songs, their family traditions, their tools, the image of their god, and so on. And third, people, the Africans who arrived stripped of everything, even of their language, unquote, even of their language or their idiom. Since in slave ships and on plantations, I quote again, people who spoke the same language were never put together, unquote. Glissant then advances a concept that seems to me to be the most singular and most powerful in his analysis of creolization, as he thinks it starting both from Creole speech and the matrix of jazz. The migrant coming from Africa having been stripped of everything, I quote, recomposes from traces a language and art that could be said to be valid for all. That could be said to be valid for all, unquote. Now, I completely agree with that. But such an assertion is obviously audacious, and one cannot help but think of Derrida's analysis of Fichte's address to German nation, where Fichte posits that some Germans are not real Germans, and that some non-Germans are at bottom more German than they are. I nevertheless share Glissant's thesis, to which I add another one that is complementary but equally essential. That is what I will develop now by way of conclusion. Deprived of all that these Germans had, for example, the Germans from Fichte, but also the migrants from Europe, etc., arriving in North America, whether they were original or adopted in Fichte's sense, the African of New America, thus stripped, I quote again, Glissant, who says, did something unpredictable, based only on the power of this memory, that is, only on thoughts of the trace that remained to him. He composed, on the one hand, Creole languages, and on the other hand, forms of art valid for all, such as, for example, the music of jazz, that is reconstructed with the help of adopted instruments, but on the basis of a trace of fundamental African reasons, unquote. That jazz has been an art form valid for all is something to which I can attest myself. For years, the only thing that I really wanted to do with my life was listen to jazz, recorded or live. I discussed this at some length in one book that is entitled The Age of Disruption, How Not to Become Mad. And I also talked about a period of incarceration when stripped, as are all prisoners, if not quite in the way that slaves are. I kept my language, for example. The only thing that was left to me was my memory, my traces, to which were added these spiritual instruments, I use an expression of Mallarmé, that are books, and that by a grace that was not divine but philosophical, that of the attention given to me by Gérard Granel, the French philosopher. I was able to practice, that is to read, just as I was able to write, thanks to the school where I had learned to do it 20 years earlier, of which still fresh traces remained in my brain and which I tried to make the most of. In drawing attention to these points, I'm not trying to conjure certain romantic features of my life, but because in prison, deprived of the jazz that had then come precisely to occupy the center of my life, I underwent a conversion. And I did so by experiencing the locality by default of the cell where I had to keep on living. This led me to reflect intensely on what constitutes a noetic memory and on what had affected me so much about jazz, among many other questions. As for jazz, I dwelt on the blue note, which according to some is not a note because it's impossible to note it, and which I believe jazz has caused to circulate around the world by combining it, on the one hand, with African rhythms reconceived through drums, that is, a set of drums and cymbals constituting what is called a drum kit. On the other hand, with recording, inasmuch as it replaced writing that had led Western music to a sublime point of development, the many discoveries of which Charles Mingus and few others, for example Duke Ellington, were able to adopt themselves. These remarks on jazz, and we should never forget the degree to which Adorno in 1944 and 47 could neither hear nor understand it, discussing Benny Goodman when he should have heard Charlie Parker. These remarks on jazz are not presented here as an aside. They are the heart of the subject of creolization, inasmuch as it can occur for better and for worse, as it extends throughout the whole world under the control of culture industries, marketing, and now social networks. This is why when Glissant posits that, I quote again, the thought of the trace seems to me to be a new dimension of what must be opposed in the current situation of the world, in what I call the thought of systems and systems of thought, unquote. I suggest we deepen his thesis by considering the trace at one and the same time as, first, a memory kept in the nervous system as a memory trace and passed down from generation to generation, notably as what will become the blues. Second, a pharmacon constituting a tertiary retention, resulting from exosomatization, such as the musical instruments studied by organology and those common objects that European colonists kept with them, their tools, Glissant says, unlike Africans who were stripped of everything. Third, the microphones of radio stations and the receivers of those who listen to these stations, but also the record players and records, then the tape recorders and recording studios, the role of which in the history of jazz I once tried to understand while at IRCAM, all of which constitute systems of hypomnesic tertiary retention. And fourth, all of these forms of the history of the supplement, as Derrida said, that the trace always implies for Derrida, even though Derrida will himself never study this this history, in this way continuing ultimately the initial movement to reject techniques that has characterized philosophy from the outset, and as its default of origin, its original fault, if we can say that. I no longer have time to specify what, in Glissant's view, is the fundamental meaning of the difference between creolization and métissage, miscegenation, crossbreeding and cross-pollination, because I prefer to finish by taking up his observation with Achille Mbembe. Let's just say that métissage can be an object of calculation, whereas creolization frees the incalculable, the unpredictable, the improbable, pure alterity, that is absolute singularity. And here I want to emphasize that what results from this is what Glissant describes as microclimates and macroclimates, that are localities, which with Sarah and Paolo we can call performative localities. It is important to note here, to finish, with Glissant that, on the one hand, he hypothesizes that every language comes from a similar creolization, every form of language, that is from a default of origin supported only by traces, which can furthermore be utterly fantastical, a little like Nino Ferrer, when a French singer, when he sings, "Je voudrais être noir," I would like to be black, and because he wanted to be a jazzman. And at this point, we should go back to the invasions that gave rise to Greece, but we no longer have time. On the other hand, Glissant points out that creolization requires laboratory territories, and he says precisely small and well-defined islands, organized or not into archipelagos. And finally, he showed that what he calls atavistic cultures are ancient composite cultures that have forgotten their Creole character, in some way like a minor genre that becomes major and academic, with which we, academics, are quite familiar, but which we tend to forget. Achille Mbembe takes up Glissant's 1996 analysis, but also, in a way, returns to it from the point of view that imposes itself on him in 2013. What creolization promises, in as much as it is not crossbreeding, métissage, nor hybridization understood in this calculated sense, such as the production of hybrid corn, for example, turns out in the 21st century, with Mbembe, and in his Critique de la raison nègre, to be a becoming black or un devenir nègre, where the issue is the extension of the stripping that had struck the slaves coming from Africa, but also from India, as Mbembe and Glissant recall, and from many other countries before this became the plantation system that can be seen as a matrix of modern capitalism, to all the forms of despoiling that purely computational capitalism, totally unbound from any compromise with the world of work, imposes on the biosphere cum technosphere by disruptively accelerating the Anthropocene, which is thus rushing headlong towards the abyss. And here, Mbembe refers to the reparation that must, for example, give constant care to the world, starting from what I believe to be what I called at the beginning of this talk, the noetic humus or noetic necromas. I quote Mbembe, who says, "The durability of the world depends on our capacity to reanimate beings and things that seem lifeless. The world will not survive unless humanity devotes itself to the task of sustaining what can be called reservoirs of life," unquote. These reservoirs presuppose giving value to what Glissant, quoted by Mbembe, calls silt. I quote Mbembe. "In ancient Africa, the seed had to produce life in a fragile and hostile environment in the midst of which humanity also had to find space for work and rest, an environment that needed protection and repair. And this double labor of transformation and regeneration was part of a cosmological assembly. Sharing the world with other beings was the ultimate depth. And it was above all the key of the survival, of both humans and non-humans. Humans and non-humans were silt for one another," unquote. Glissant also, I quote again, saw silt as a residue deposited along the banks of rivers, in the midst of archipelagos, in the depths of oceans, along valleys and at the feet of cliffs, everywhere, and especially in those arid and deserted places where, through an unexpected reversal, fertilizer gave birth to new forms of life, work, and language, unquote. I read these lines bearing in mind what Glissant says about the unexpected of clearization, what Boyce says about social sculpture, and what Fujita says about the conquest of imperfection, where silt is precisely the accumulation of those traces that begin with exosomatization 3 million years ago, and which has now become a reticulated data industry, operating at 2/3 of the speed of light, disintegrating the localities that are home to creolizations of all kinds: language, arts, ways of life, cities, mathematics, sciences, philosophy, law, etc., and sport also, and which must again be made to serve always idiomatic noises, just as Charlie Parker made the radio and the recording industry serve music. Thanks to my friends who are musicians, poets, visual artists, architects, but also scientists, and as a co-responsibility claimed by a philosopher addressing himself to artists in order to work on the most urgent task to rebuild the economy, political as well as libidinal. Thank you very much for your patience.
Bueno, muchas gracias a Bernard por esa charla súper interesante que logra conectar, ¿no?, desde el origen de la vida, las problemáticas de la biología con problemáticas artísticas, problemáticas tecnológicas contemporáneas y el pensamiento de Glissant y Achille Mbembe, que son dos pensadores súper importantes para nosotros. Como no tenemos muchísimo tiempo, vamos a aceptar unas preguntas. Si alguien quiere hacer preguntas, ese es el momento.
Entonces, bueno, agradecer primero esta tremenda exposición, un masazo conceptual que cuesta mucho digerir, pero que algunas cosas quedan ahí dando vueltas, ¿no? Y me quiero situar dentro de la problemática de la entropía y la negentropía, ¿no? Y a propósito de las citaciones que usted hacía de escritores norteamericanos que constituyen un linaje, como diría Deleuze, ¿no?, específico, citar a William Burroughs, ¿no?, que en textos como Naked Lunch o Nova Express señala insistentemente, ¿no?, de que el problema de todo sistema vivo o biológico o cualquiera que este fuese, es qué hacer con los residuos. Esos residuos que un sistema produce van a dar siempre a otro sistema que los absorbe, los recicla, los ocupa, y nuevamente esto va a dar a otro sistema y así, ¿no? Habría un traspaso escatológico, ¿no?, de residuos de un lugar hacia otro que van generando lo que usted ha denominado la creolización planetaria, quizás pensarlo de esa perspectiva, ¿no? Dicho eso, me parece que es interesante esa perspectiva en el actual contexto global, y la pregunta sería ahí, desde la mirada que usted pone en juego y de la dimensión, digamos, en que se constituyen las subordinaciones en las cuales la globalización en todas sus dimensiones se articula desde una estructura subordinantes unas de otras, ¿no? ¿Dónde estaría el límite de aquello, ¿no? Porque siempre van quedando ciertos elementos que van siendo como, por decirlo así, desechados, ¿no? Usted, por ejemplo, mencionaba el tema del jazz, que yo se lo podría contraponer a otra dimensión musical que es el bolero, que tiene una fuerte presencia africana y que se va desplazando de un lugar a otro por todo el continente americano, generando una forma específica de musicalización que tiene elementos también comunes con el jazz, afinaciones de guitarras, etcétera, ¿no? Bueno, dicho eso, la pregunta más concreta sería esta, ¿no? ¿Cuál el límite político de esto? ¿Cuál sería? ¿Cómo usted lo ve? ¿Cómo usted ve, digamos, esta problemática de estos elementos residuales que van siendo dejados fuera, ¿no?, de estos procesos de creolización? Que me parece interesante como usted lo plantea como opuesto al mestizaje, que serían cosas diferenciadas, ¿no? Eso, de lo que se puede ocurrir ahora. Gracias.
¿Otra? Thanks. I'd like to thank Bernard for an incredibly rich and interesting presentation. And I suppose I think that given the importance of your centrality in the discourse, I think it's important also in the context of the pluriverse and questions about diversity to, I suppose, draw attention to the fact that it's a very masculine perspective that's been presented in terms of references and artists as well. And I think just in terms of the idea of creolization, it's important to talk about queering the discourse as well. So I just wanted to make that observation because also in terms of the program, the content within the program is again, the female representation is very low.
Thank you. Thank you very much for these questions. The question of the waste, the residue, is the most important one. And this is the one I called noetic necromass, but also humus in the sense of necromass for the biomass, in the sense of Vernadsky. It is Vernadsky who created this concept of necromass. What is a noetic necromass? As a residue, it is first shit, as you said. That is the most toxic things. But the question is to transform them. That is, toxic means entropic. The question is how to transform them, entropy, into not only negentropy, but anti-entropy. Here I must highlight the fact that the traditional concepts are entropy and negentropy, or low entropy and high entropy, but Giuseppe Longo with Francis Bailly, who was a physicist, introduced this concept of anti-entropy. That is very important. Why? Because negentropy is also called order. And you can see an order as something that obliges you to follow a way of life that is not yours, and that is entropic for you. So the question is to have three levels of entropy, negentropy, and anti-entropy, because it is a question of point of view. The question is, where are you? When you are inside the system, you don't see the system like somebody outside the system, etc. It's a very classic question of theory of system. Now, I say that because, as I said at the beginning of my talk, my point of view is a question of quasi-causality. When I refer to, for example, to Joe Bousquet or to Django Reinhardt or to Charlie Parker, etc., there are typically singularities becoming the quasi-causality of radio for Charlie Parker, of the wound of Joe Bousquet, etc., or of Django Reinhardt. But I think that the waste or the residues are also for example, I don't remember his name now. The question is how to transform what is toxic into something that becomes curative. And this is today our problem, but at an incredible level. And here, the question is a question of practice, but also a question of scales. I mean, when I say scales, what does that mean, a question of practice? It means social culture in the sense of Joseph Beuys, that is political economy, politics, as you said. And here, what is politics? It is distributed on various scales. The level of the psychic individual, the process of psychic individuation, and even under the psychic individual, because an individual is always, it's himself plural, diverse, and dealing with many, many possibilities, as it was showed by Nietzsche, Marcel Proust, etc., etc. We are never one person. We are always dealing with many possibilities of personalities, identifications, etc. And this is also a question of crealization, because it is a process of identification that is successful. Now, the problem of politics is, and not only of politics, but also of political economy. I am a post-Marxist, as it is said today. So I consider that politics is always also economics. And it's impossible to separate the two. This is the point of view of the bourgeois, liberal economists, for example. But I consider bourgeoisie is finished, now it's mafia. And I prefer bourgeoisie than mafia. But I think that the question today is to articulate those scales at diverse levels, and this is a question of political economy. Why political? Because it is dealing with the formation, the building of the individual. Economy, because the individual exists only as a sculpture of the social. So it is a question of political economy. And here, the problem and the aporia, and it is aporetic, there is no solution. No, it's impossible to solve this problem. It is a pharmacological problem, is that the minor becomes always major. And for example, this is what is said by Glisson when he said that the composite people that are those of crealization always tend to become atavistic people, that is dominant, etc., etc. And it is impossible to avoid that. So this is a problem of the relationship between knowledge and power. And I think that it is our stake today we have to rethink completely these questions, but in the context of the Anthropocene, that is of entropy. And for me, entropy was the concept that nobody was capable to think in the 20th century for many problems, for many reasons. Heidegger, even Deleuze, he tried to, but he failed. And I think we have now, and it's not my task, it is a collective one. We have to work together, artists, philosophers, mathematicians, physicists, etc., for trying to solve this problem. That is a problem of emergency. That is a problem that was addressed by Guterres at the United Nations 9 months ago. Now, I don't understood very well your second question, I'm sorry, because myself, I consider that diversality and pluriversality are not exactly the same question. The question of diversality is one addressed by Glisson as a poet. Pluriversality would be more the question of what I addressed myself when I said myself, Stiegler, for example, I am many people. And it's not only diversality, it's pluriversality. Sometimes I tend to become this and sometimes to become that, etc. And it is a conflict, a psychological conflict, and also a conflict, a moral conflict, etc., etc. This is the reason for which we will discuss that next Monday. I pretend that intermittency is our destiny, our fate. Now, what I understood in what you said is that crealization, that is not only a question of language, of course, or not only a question of constitution of people, in the sense of one people, for example, of political questions. It's also the question of genre. It is also the question of diverse forms of communities and not necessarily communities, but similarities, etc., groups. It is today absolutely necessary to think these questions with the question of exosomatization. And this was never really analyzed. For example, Derrida, he was my supervisor, and we were very close friends. Derrida never addressed this question when he tried to address the question of sexual difference, phallogocentrism, etc., etc. And I think he was wrong. And I think it is also a problem in Freud. Freud never addresses really the question of tools, for example, of weapons, of these objects that are also the objects of fetishism, of the traditional object that are artifacts, the object of fantasy. And it talks about that everywhere. For example, in interpretation of dream, when he talks about hats, boxes, instruments, tools, etc., in the dream. But he never addresses the question of why such artifactual things are so important in dreaming. And I think that we have to completely revisit the question of life that is also sexuation, etc., from such a point of view. Sexuation in for example, the life of plants or the life of animals is not at all desire. It is drive, it is instinct, it is sexual instinct, etc., reproduction. There are also intermittent phases that are very important, but with artifices, with technology, it changed completely. Rousseau addresses this question, is the origin of, comment ça s'appelle le titre en français, le discourse on the origin of inequality. He addresses this question when he says that sexual drive into human is not linked to seasons, etc., and it is provoked by what he calls the ecliptic, that is what will produce artifacts, language, etc., etc. I don't know if I really address your question. I hope so. Thank you for your question then.
Soy muy triste decirles que se nos acabó el tiempo de las preguntas pero podemos seguir, tenemos ahora un coffee break, 10 minutos, y podemos seguir hablando de esos y otros temas en el receso. Y bueno, gracias. Nos vemos en 10 minutos aquí para empezar nuevamente con la última sesión de la tarde, ¿sí? Gracias.